Hi everyone, I'm Catherine, the artist behind Bigelow Fine Arts. Are you following along with me? How is your coloring going? I'm moving on to these two small meteors today, as well as finishing up a few small corals I didn't work on from the big meteor. My pencils are in hand and I'm ready to get going. Come along and join me and let's color this in together. I began with a light base layer of the purple pink for this clump of fan coral. I'll be working it up in a similar way to what I did on the little meteoroid. After I get down the pink, I put in a light layer with the magenta over the whole fan, with a little more down along the stem where I know there will be a shadow. I come in with a light layer of the scarlet over the whole fan. I'm building up a depth of color here, blending the colors together in light layers. I'm not looking for that one perfect color, I just blend together what I want. After the scarlet, I come back in with the magenta to darken the vein lines over the fan to help them stand out more. I bring in the sepia to add in a few shadows and also bring out the vein lines a little more. I add another layer of the purple pink over the whole fan to blend everything together and fill in the tooth of the paper. Under the fan there is a long thin coral that reminds me of the yellow-red coral, so I'm going with it. I begin with a base layer with the cadmium yellow. I want to make sure I am putting in several layers, as this is the only color that will be put in for the tips and most of the upper branches. I also hit up some of the same coral type on the larger of the small meteoroids, and on the smallest one I fill in the carrot coral, as I know I will have to fill them in at some point. I am now starting to work more by color than purely by coral type, so I will likely be jumping around a little more than I did on the first few videos. At this point, I think I have colored up most of the different coral types, and I am simply going through and coloring them based on those first few with minor changes, mostly because I have forgotten the exact order or color. With the scarlet, I want to add in the veining on the red-yellow coral. I also fill in most of the bottom of the coral to make it seem as though the color is creeping up from the base into the branches. I then come in with the orange and blend out some of the lines to make sure they aren't harsh, and to blend the bottom to really make sure it looks like the color is bleeding upwards. I come back in with the yellow to add in more layers and blend everything together more. Since I already put in a layer of yellow on the carrot coral, it only stands to reason that I should tackle that next. So with the green, I add in several layers along the top bumps. They will only be green, so I can go pretty heavy with the layers. I want to add in a layer on the shadowed side of the carrots. This is on the side with the lines, which switch around which side they are on. I am following the line art and not setting up my own source. Or maybe the lines are for decoration. Either way, I'm adding in more layers of green on the side with the lines and the lightest layers to the side with no lines. I want to lightly tint the yellow so it isn't quite so yellow compared to the green. I then come in with the yellow lemon to add in another layer with the yellow that has more green in it. In order to darken up the shadows, I bring in the dark sepia and put it along the side with the lines, adding in a few layers and working it lightly towards the middle. I also add in shadows to the yellow-red coral, since I didn't do that earlier. This bubble brain coral is next. I come in with the ivory as a base layer, as it is the closest color to beige that I think I have in the polychromos. I fill in the crevices with the scarlet, then I bring in the orange to blend out the red and add in some detail to the brain coral. I add in more layers with the ivory, then bring in the sepia to darken up the shadows. This is a pretty small coral. I could have colored it one color and it would barely be noticeable against the other brightly colored corals. Above the fan, there is a tiny bubble coral peeking out, so I add in a base layer of the yellow, a tiny bit of shadow and shaping with the orange, then another layer with the yellow. On the meteoroid, there are two larger brain bubble corals. I give them a base layer in the yellow over the entire ball. With the orange, I fill in the bottommost part of the ball, leaving a yellow crescent at the top. I also make sure the orange is darker at the bottom and lighter closest to the yellow crescent. This will give it the illusion of being spherical and not flat. I use the scarlet to darken up the bottom even more, which really helps the illusion of making a flat something into a spherical something. I'll touch up the layers just to make sure I have everything smoothly blended, then I want to come in with the sepia to really make the bottom shadow dark. I also add in shadows between the corals. There is some finger coral on this small meteoroid. I give it a base layer with the cobalt green over all the finger coral. I'm going light here because it is just an initial layer, not a final or filling layer. I want to be able to add more color on top, but I also want some of the tooth of the paper already filled in. Now that I am not fighting the color of the paper, I can bring in the green and hit up the tips of the fingers and even blend that down part of the way. I brighten up the tips with the yellow lemon, keeping it just to the very top parts. I define some of the shadows with the blue-greenish, working up from the base and up between and around the fingers. I blend the edge of the blue-greenish shadow with the light phthalo blue and work that up the fingers a little as well. And I might as well hit up the tiered coral while I have the light phthalo blue in hand, since they will be a similar color. I hit the edges with the ivory to lighten it up and fill in the paper more. I begin to darken up the stems and underneath each layer with the phthalo blue, blending it into the light blue I put in for the rest of the tiers. I darken the shadows with the blue-greenish. To bring everything together, I blend in with more light blue on top, filling in the paper. There are a couple of tiny coral bits sticking out that I wasn't sure what to do with, so I hit them with the scarlet and I'm calling them done. For the carrot coral, I wasn't sure if they were sitting on a chunk of rock or a coral. I opted to go for coral since coral comes in bright colors. I went with the bubble brain coral colors, beginning with a light layer of orange over the whole coral. With the scarlet, I began to block off shadows and darken up crevices, basically giving the coral some texture and features. I added in another layer of orange to fill in the color better. I keep my layers light, so I have to come back in and add more layers to get the depth of color I want. I then used the dark sepia to finish off the shadows, to get them really dark, especially in the deepest part of the crevices. The last coral I colored in this section is a small coral in the crease of the book. I laid in a layer of the yellow lemon and added in a tiny bit of details with the green. There isn't much I can do for this coral, as it is along the bend of the page and into the crease. I just wanted to get some color on it so it wasn't white against a sea of color. I'm moving up to the top right to this little group of coral chunks with the shark and turtle. I'm starting with the branching coral with several layers of the yellow over the whole coral. Initially, I was only going to use the scarlet to push color up into the branches, but I also decided to color the coral it was sitting on a scarlet as well. I do push some of the color up into the branches, and at any points I think there might be a shadowed spot. I use the orange to blend out the edges of the scarlet in the branches, as well as adding a layer over the coral below. I blend everything together with the yellow. I touch up the scarlet again, keeping it to the areas I think should be dark. Then I come in with the sepia and get the shadows in place. I'm working up all the finger coral next, of which there is a good chunk of it between these two meteoroids. I come in with my base layer of cobalt green. I feel like at this point I finally have the process down for these. I felt like it took most of the large meteor before I found a process that gave me the colors I wanted. I come in with the green on the tops of the fingers. I bring in the blue-greenish to work up the shadows at the base of the fingers as well as around and behind the fingers to help some of them stand out. I can't do this for all the fingers, but if there are any in the back I can go around, I do. I use the yellow lemon to brighten up just the very tips of the fingers. I give several layers here to help it stand out. I then touch up the bottom of the corals with the sepia for shadows and blend it out with a little bit more of the blue-greenish. This bubbly coral is next. I begin with the ivory over the whole coral. I darken up the crevices with the scarlet to add in shadows against the highlight of the ivory. I smooth out the transition from scarlet to ivory with some orange, then come back in to finish filling in the coral with more ivory. For the pink grass, I'm not sure why I went with pink, but there is more here. I put down a good several layers of pink over the entire blade of grass. This is the only color the tips will receive, so I might as well just go ahead and fill it in. I used the magenta to add a shadow at the base, touching up with the pink and magenta to get the blend to work out. Then I deepen the shadow with the sepia. This grass works up pretty quick. I wasn't sure what to do with this swirly maze ball next, and I flipped over my protective sheet to see if I had colored one before. I was sure I had, but I couldn't find one quickly. I think this one is similar to the snake wall I did on the large meteor, but I picked a few colors and went with it. I put in a layer of yellow lemon over everything, then came in with green. I kept the green to the thin lines that I think are the tops of the wrinkles. I clearly didn't have a sharp enough pencil for filling in these thin lines and had to work at it to get them filled in without making a mess of the whole thing. I added in some shadows with the sepia, then touched them up with the orange. I don't think it needed the orange, and I probably should have just skipped it. Overall, I don't think it ruined it. I just don't think it was needed. Only a couple more things left, including this blob that the finger coral is growing out of. I put in a base layer of yellow over all of it. I came in with the orange to begin blocking off some of the shadows, which are easy to find since it is included in the line art. I can then use the scarlet to darken up the center of the orange sections even more. I have colored up several of these things, and sometimes I add in the scarlet first and blend out the edges with the orange, and other times I add in the larger section of orange and darken up the middle with the scarlet. I don't have any reason for working it up one way over the other. Once I have the scarlet in place, I need to come in and add more yellow to fill in the rest of the coral that I didn't get multiple layers of color over. Now I can use the sepia to better define the shadows, keeping it to the scarlet and near the finger coral that would also create a cast shadow. I decided to hit up the shark. How hard can a shark be? They're gray, right? I used the warm gray 5 on the darker top part and the ivory on the bottom. I put in a light touch of blue for some shadowing, but I wasn't really feeling it. Maybe if this was an ocean scene where I knew I would be adding blue around the shark, it would work, but I don't think that was the right spot for the blue. I was pretty light, so in the end, most of it just vanishes into the other layers. I begin to work up the shadows, and for this, I begin with the sepia over the dark sections and behind the gills, but then I go back and forth between the gray 5 and sepia to slowly darken up the shadows and add layers to the shark. I want to darken the two colors together so one doesn't overpower the other. I touch up the ivory on the bottom again and add more blue that I still don't think is necessary. And now I have one of the sea creatures finally colored in. That covers it for today. Tomorrow I'll be moving on to another couple of clumps of coral below this one and working up more of the sea life as well, so stay tuned for that. I hope you've been following along. Please let me know. I'd love to know how your coral looks. I'm on MeWe and would love to build a coloring community there with everyone to share art, talk art, and discuss supplies. I have my social media links below. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, MeWe, and Patreon. Patreon has a short write-up as well as all the palettes I am using and a list of the timestamps, and it's available for everyone. If you have any questions or page requests, please leave them below or reach out to me on social media. I put in a list of chapter breaks in the show notes as well as a list of equipment I like to use. If you use any of my affiliate links, it really helps me out without costing you a thing. I want to thank you all so much for coming along and joining in with me on this coloring journey. I appreciate all my subscribers and look forward to more of you joining in and coloring along with me. Please like, share, and subscribe to help that happen. Until next time, happy coloring.